Hey, how are you all doing? Um, I've just been making some shelf brackets for someone, and that's given me an excuse to fire at the forge and look for some metal to make these. And while I've been doing it, I came across a couple of pieces of this. You can see the curve in it. That's because this is high tensile spring steel. This and the other bit that I've got lying around here were a leaf spring out of a Morris Minor, an old English car from the 1960s. And I've been hanging on to it because it's narrow and it's thin enough to one day be made into a knife blade. So I dug this out and I've just cleaned one of them up lightly. It is a little bit pitted, but it's cleanable, upable. And what I'm going to do is make my first knife. When I started blacksmithing and built the forge and bought the anvil and things like that, I tried to tell myself I'm not going to be a knife maker. Everybody says, oh, you've got a forge, oh, I've watched that program on TV, you could make knives. I didn't want to go there because it was so mainstream. But now, with the end of the world at hand and not being able to buy good quality anything in New Zealand unless you pay absolute top dollar for it, I'm sick of buying stuff made out of Chinesium and having it fall apart in no time flat. So I'm going to make myself one knife. I'm not going to become a knife maker, but I'm going to make myself one decent knife. This is a nice piece of steel, well capable of it. So I'll clear this stuff out of the way, and quickly as I can, I'm going to whip this thing into a knife and straighten it, of course, because at the moment it's a leaf spring. And then we'll make a nice handle for it out of some hardwood. I've got some old decking timber that's lying around here. I might get a little piece of that, laminate it up, and see what we can make. A good bushcraft knife. Something I can use that's part way to being an axe. I can hit it with a hammer. I can chisel and gouge with it. It's going to be a Tarzan knife. So no mucking about. Let's get on with it.
Starting off with a plan is always a good idea. So now that I've cleared a space, I've got to decide exactly what shape this knife is going to be. So what I'm going to do is just grind the rust off the leaf spring and get it down to where I can draw on it and just draw the profile of my knife. Just decide how the handle is going to be, how much curve the blade is going to have, any other features it might have, and then start grinding it in. I'm going to give it a straight top edge, but I'm going to drop the top edge down a little way, and then I'm going to work on the handle. In hindsight, I shouldn't have worked on the handle at all until I'd finished the blade, because that would have given me a squarer, straighter piece of metal to hold in the vise instead of trying to hold in the vise a partly formed handle. So do as I say, not as I do. If you're going to have a go at this, make the blade first, then work on the handle. I've cut huge chunks of footage out of this because you don't need to watch me sanding and grinding for hours and hours. But the basic concept is to cut it to shape and then put in the recesses and the edges onto the blade and then finish it off and finally polish it. So I'm starting off with the angle grinder with a cutting disc, then I'm moving to a grinding disc to get it down to shape, and then I'm into sanding discs. I've only got a 36 grit and a 60 grit disc. If I was And here's the finish that you'll see with a 60 grit. Still a lot of polishing to be done. What I'm doing now is, in the absence of having any Prussian blue, marking blue, I'm just using a felt tip pen to leave a nice dark blue line on here so that I can scratch into it with some odd leg calipers and get the same offset from the edge of the blade on both sides, and then I'll grind to that line. On the edge it's pretty much the same thing, but I can't use the odd leg calipers because they won't close down close enough, so I'm going to use ordinary dividers because they'll close down to absolutely nothing, and then by alternating from side to side I can check to make sure that I'm in the absolute center, and I can then mark that center line all the way down my edge. And then, so long as the light's good and my eyes can see, I'll be able to grind down to that line on both sides and get it absolutely symmetrical. Knife makers, of course, have jigs for doing all this. It's a lot easier when you've got the gear. Another little thing that I learned from actually doing it that I couldn't learn off the YouTube videos is right here at the end of the relieved part of the blade. It's hard to get the grinder to stop at exactly the right point every time. So if I ever do a knife blade again, what I will do is clamp a piece of wood across there so that the grinder hits the sacrificial piece of wood and stops, so that I get a sharp line where I need a sharp line. Running it out the way I have, in a slight curve, I guess it's an acceptable way of doing it. There you go. You can see how it's fairly symmetrical on both sides. I'm about halfway down. I've still got a long way to go, but it's coming along. I'm starting to pay particular attention now to getting it looking nice. Roughing it down in the initial stages just allows you to get your eye in, and when you get beyond halfway, that's when you can make no mistakes, because there is no putting back grinder, only a taking off grinder. So as I say, at the back of the blade, this point that I'm working up to, would be nice if I had put a block of wood across there so that the blade would stop at exactly the right spot every time. Maybe I'll do that if I ever make another one. Changing now from the 36 grit and going down to a 60 grit sanding disc. And just taking enough off to remove any scratches. And now I'll go into it with some 120 sandpaper on a block. Sanding, sanding, sanding once again, just until the scratches are gone. Because this was a leaf spring and it spent 50 or 60 years underneath a car unpainted, it was quite pitted with rust, so for me to remove the rust pitting completely would require hours and hours of work. I've put a lot more work into this than you guys are seeing in this 25-30 minute video. It took me about 5 hours work, Here I am now going down to, I think that is 240 grit, wet. And from the 240, I'll go down to 400 and finish off with 1000 grit. And that'll give me a nice satin smooth finish. The knife can be left like this, but by putting a polish onto it, you end up with a more durable knife that will not rust if it's left outside overnight in the rain. It will slide better through anything that you're cutting, whether it be meat, vegetables, or a tree branch. So now I'm here with the 1000 grit, putting in the final polish. And this is a rag mop on a drill. This came from a super cheap auto store. I believe it's just for getting slight imperfections out of paint. They're dirt cheap. I start off at slow speed so I don't throw the bathroom cleaner all over the place, and then I can speed up to a higher speed to do the actual polishing once it's spread around the wheel. You can see those rust pits. I'm going to look at those with a bit of a smile each time I use the knife and remind myself that it used to be a car leaf spring rather than a pristine, bespoke handmade knife by some craftsman. This will polish up nicely and be a good serviceable knife for after the apocalypse. Well, that's the sticky end about done. Time to start working on the grabby end. I'll protect it with a few layers of masking tape so that I can't damage it, and probably wrap it in some cardboard while I'm holding it in the vise. There's not much work to do on the handle other than drill some holes in it so that the glue can travel from side to side. Make sure that the wooden pieces of the handle stay where they're put. So I'm going to put 5 centre punch marks along a centre line that I've drawn on the handle. 2 of them will be small 3/16 diameter holes that take brass pins. The other 3 will be larger holes, and they're just to allow the glue to have somewhere to bite in and turn the 3 pieces of knife, the blade and the 2 fillets of timber that are on either side, into one cohesive glued piece. Because this is a leaf spring and it's made of high tensile steel, I've got to use plenty of cutting fluid, so I'm just putting a cutting paste onto each of the centre point marks, and I'm going to drill these holes at a fairly slow speed because it's hard on drills. I'll put the 3/16 drill for the brass pins through all of the holes first, and it will be a pilot hole for the bigger ones, and then we'll whip that out, and I'll put a 3/8 drill through just to give the glue something to bite into. I'm just slowing the drill down by changing the belts up above. Because of the larger diameter drill you use, the slower speed it has to turn, especially on a hard steel like this. a little more lube, because even after just 3 holes, the drill is starting to lose its edge on this material. Hear how it's slightly squeakier? That's because it's dulling off. It'll need a sharpen. Many years ago I did an apprenticeship as an engineer, a fitter and turner, and I spent the first year of my apprenticeship sweeping floors and grinding drill bits. So I can grind a drill with one hand tied behind my back under enemy fire in the pitch dark on a rainy night. And now I'll just knock the edge off those holes with a countersinking bit, just to make sure that the wood fillets sit down nicely against it. These countersinking bits also have to be run at a very low speed. I've chosen a piece of 40-year-old Quila hardwood decking timber to go with my 60-year-old leaf spring bush knife, and I'm going to cut that on my 50-year-old Skill bench saw, which I think has also got a 50-year-old blade. A generous blob of epoxy 2-pot adhesive mixed together in situ, because hey, why waste some doing it on a piece of cardboard or plastic? Mix it where you're going to work with it, that way there's no waste. So I want a liberal coating over one side of the blade, and this is 5-minute epoxy, so I'll put one of the pieces of wood on, leave it for 5 or 10 minutes until it's set, after tapping it into exactly the right place, of course. I'll leave that for 10 or 15 minutes, and then I can take the clamps off and do the other side as well and double clamp it. But what I'm doing now is transferring the 2 3/16 holes through into the wood, so that I know where they are, and then when I've got the other part of the handle glued on the other side, I can drill back through the other way and have a pin right the way through that will take my brass pins when the whole thing's glued up and finished. After an hour or so, when the glue is good and hard, I can put a coarse sanding belt on the sander. I've got a 60 grit here, and I can start roughing the handle down. Belt sanders really are cool, you know. You've got the flat bit on the bottom, you've got the nice curved piece on the end. You can achieve so much with them. You can do inside curves, outside curves, flat pieces. Even this piece here, the soft part of the belt between the roller and the backing plate, is really useful for soft sanding. It's not so aggressive, it gives a nice gentle radius effect. and it's good for finishing curves like this. It'll blend a curve into a straight. So for such a cheap tool, you can buy a cheap belt sander for 40 bucks. That's US dollars I'm talking. A good one will cost you 600 or 700. There's a vast difference between the two, but you can do so much with a cheap belt sander. Now, I can't get the belt sander in behind this step in the blade, so I'm having to do this bit with the angle grinder.
Well, it was right about here when I ran out of gigs on my memory cards, so unfortunately I kept working, camera didn't keep filming. So I did the rest of the knife without filming it, which is really unfortunate. But here's the finished knife. I'll try and get the finger marks off it. I've still got to put the brass pins through the handle. I didn't have anything suitable. I did find a couple of brass screws, but because they've got thread around the outside of it, at whatever point I cut them off on the surface, they would look awful. So I've decided I'll leave it till Monday, wait until I can get some brazing rod, 3/16 brazing rod, and I'll just glue that in there with epoxy glue, give this a final sand, and then I can give it a coat in a good quality oil, and there's my finished knife. Nice and sharp, nicely ground. I learnt all this from YouTube videos. I watched 3 videos. Granted, the kind of people who are making knives and doing it on YouTube have all the gear. They had multiple grades of sandpaper, which I don't have. I only had about 3 grades. They have cutting compound. I didn't have any cutting compound and ended up using bathroom cleaner. It's abrasive. It works. The cloth mop that I used is a cheap polishing mop from Super Cheap, the automotive discount store. My handle is made out of Quila decking. I'm going to oil that with whatever oil I can find. I haven't even looked. Might end up just being olive oil. But it's a nice, heavy, weighty, chunky knife. I've left the curve in it. All the way I've been making it, you're probably thinking, he hasn't taken the curve out. He hasn't straightened the knife blade. Why is it bent like that? As I was handling it, I decided I've never owned a curved knife. I quite like the feel of a curved knife. I can imagine that this would be handy in various applications. If it doesn't work out, I'll chuck it in a drawer and I'll go and make another one. Because, do you know what? I quite like knife making now. It's very therapeutic. You should try it.